In the next steps, we are going to work on our back flap again. So since this is going to be on the opposite side of the bag as our front flap was, we're going to make our marks up here at the top of the zipper placket opposite to what we did before. So I am going to mark a line 1 1/4 inches away from this side, and just mark a line right up there at the top like that. And on the other side, it's going to be a 1-inch line. And if you remember, on the front flap, those two marks were flipped. And that is because on the front flap, the end of the zipper was on this side, but on the back flap, the end of the zipper will be on this side. So you'll want to fold back your handle and grab the other side of your zipper that we have turned at a 90-degree angle. And we're going to lay the zipper down right sides together along the top of the zipper placket, lining up that 90-degree side of your zipper with the 1-inch mark. Clip that in place along the entire top edge until you reach this mark here that you made at 1 1/4 inches. And we are going to transfer that mark. Just kind of pull your zipper down a little bit so you can see the mark, and then transfer it over. Just make the mark on the zipper tape where that first mark was on the zipper placket. And that is where we're going to start basting. So we're going to put our needle down in that mark. And then when you're with your foot lifted up, you're going to move the end of the zipper down so that it veers off the top edge of your zipper placket the same way our front flap did. Put your foot down and back stitch so that you are now stitching off the zipper, and then go forward and continue to baste this all the way across. Until you get to the end of the zipper. And I'll show you a little more of what we did back here, a close-up. So here you can see is where I started my baste stitch, right at that mark that I made. I made the zipper veer down a little bit here, and then I back stitched off the zipper and then came forward. And that is going to secure that angle of the zipper downward so that it can veer out of this top seam. Next, you are going to take your zipper placket inner piece. This is the 3-inch piece, and we're going to lay it down on top of the zipper. And this is a little bit of a different construction from the front flap. We're doing it opposite. So the zipper placket outer piece goes on first, and we're going to line up the sides, and we're going to line up the top and just clip it in place. Now I'm moving the end of my zipper down so that it's no longer sticking out this way. It's now pointing down so that I can clip this placket in place. Okay, and that is what your zipper placket should look like now. And we're going to do the same seam allowance trick that we did before, where we start at this edge sewing at a 1/2 inch seam allowance, stop before you hit the top edge at about 1/4 inch away from the top edge, pivot and go across the top sewing at 1/4 inch, stopping here before you get to the side at about 1/2 inch, and then sew down this edge at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So 1/2 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And that's important because you're sewing a zipper at the top of this placket, and so you won't be able to stitch this part at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Again, if it helps to mark your 1/4 of an inch, go ahead and do that, where you can mark up at this corner where to stop a 1/4 of an inch away from the edge so that you can pivot and change your seam allowance. Okay, we pivoted and we are now sewing at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And the end of our zipper was not caught in any of those stitches. And we're stopping about 1/2 an inch away from the edge. I can go just a little bit further. I'm going to hand crank this stitch so it's shorter. Okay, there we go. Now I'm at about 1/2 an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to stitch all the way down to the bottom of the zipper placket out inner piece. Okay, so you can see here 1/2 an inch, and then 1/4 of an inch all the way across and 1/2 an inch down. Next, we are going to grab our uninterfaced flap liner piece, and we're going to put it right sides together with our flap. But you can see here our handles are in the way, so I'm just going to kind of bend them upwards so that they stay out of my way, and then lay my flap down. We don't need to fold the top of the flap liner piece down this time like we did for the front flap. It can just stay the way that it is. And we're just going to clip all the way around, flattening these handles so that the flap liner reaches all the way to the edge of the flap. Now we're going to make sure that our zipper pocket liner is pulled up towards the top of the flap so that we don't catch the liner in any of our stitches. And now stitch all the way around the flap liner at a 1/2 an inch seam allowance. Okay, you're going to want to make sure, again, once you approach this edge, that your zipper is staying out of all seams. And then finish your stitches at the top of your liner, back stitching at the end. Okay, we didn't stitch through our zipper pocket liner at all, and our flap liner is now secured to the back of our flap. Next, you are going to trim our corners. Okay, so I just trim really close to the corner of my stitches and do the same on this side. I like to make sure that I'm not cutting through any of the zipper tape, because that could cause it to unravel later on. And then with pinking shears, I'm going to cut around the curve at the bottom of the flap, but again, you can use regular scissors for this and just cut notches. But that removes a lot of the bulk from the corners, and then they lay flat and nice once we have this turned. All right, next we are going to turn the flap right side out. And poke out the corners as you do this as well. I just use a bone creaser for this. I like how it's a blunt point at the end and it's rigid and strong. So you can really kind of work those corners. Even the curves down at the bottom need to be worked out. All right. So as you'll notice, your zipper pocket liner is kind of scrunched up inside here because it is longer than the flap. So it doesn't have anywhere to go. It's contained with the flap liner. So I am just basically pushing it down as far as it'll go. And now the flap liner is basically folded in half. You can see how this is the bottom edge of the flap liner. It's just folded back on itself for now, just to give this the ability to lay flat. And we are going to clip all the way around, rolling the seams in our fingers so that we can prepare for top stitching. Okay, so top stitching this back flap is actually going to happen in 2 different steps. So I'm only clipping the top portion of the back flap where the zipper placket is. And we are going to start down here on the front of the flap, right where the zipper placket inner piece ends. Just kind of eyeball it. It doesn't have to be super perfect, but start right about there where the zipper placket inner piece ends, and then top stitch up the side across the top, ending down on the other side right where the zipper placket inner piece ends. And leave your tails long at the start and the stop so that you don't have to backstitch. This is also a good point to bring out your pliers again and squeeze that seam. That seam on the front has kind of some bulk in it. Just squeeze that out, and I like to squeeze the corners as well. Flip it around and do the other side. And that will just distribute the bulk into a wider area so it's not all in one spot. And you can do this with a hammer. You can hammer your seams instead of squeezing them. But either way, that has done wonders with how thick that seam is right there. Okay. All right, and we are going to end right there. Pull our threads long and clip them off. So you can see I started there, which is right about where the zipper placket ended. And I ended my stitch right there where on the other side where it ends. So went up across the top and back down again. And now we are going to pull these threads to the back. But I'm gonna wait to tie these off because in a minute we are gonna have 2 other pieces of thread to tie onto those. So just leave them where they're at for now. And then reach inside and pull the liner of the zipper pocket up. Try and keep everything as flat as possible. And I actually like to fold the edges in like this. And then it's out of your way for top stitching this bottom portion. But before we do that, we are going to clip it. So roll everything in your fingers and clip the sides. So now we're ready to top stitch the bottom and sides of our flap. And we're gonna start right where the top stitching ended when we did the top of the flap. Only this time we're going to top stitch at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So we're going to start a little farther in than what we did on the top seam allowance. So the lines of stitching are not going to connect with each other. They're just going to start and stop right about the same level. And I'll show you that when I'm done. All right, I have top stitched all the way around, down the side, across the bottom, and up the other side. And you can see here that my stitches started at the same level where the other ones ended, only this time I stitched at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance rather than the 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I stitched 1/4 of an inch all the way around and stopped my stitches here about the same level where the other top stitching started. So I didn't go past those. And then I took the threads that were in the front, I pulled them to the back, and then I tied them off with the threads that were left over from the top stitching up here. So there's 4 strands knotted back here. Next, I'm going to show you what I did off camera because unfortunately my camera was not recording when I performed the next step. But when I flipped this to the back side, what I did here is I trimmed away the flap liner about 1/2 inch away from the top stitching that we just did. And all the way, I put my scissors all the way up underneath here and trimmed away the entire flap about 1/2 inch away. And the reason that we do that is so that now our zipper pocket liner can lay flat and it's not inhibited by the flap liner anymore. And also, we just used the flap liner as basically a facing that we were able to use so that now the flap is no longer raw edges down here. So we're able to cut it away because we will be stitching this flap to the back of the bag and you will no longer be able to see the back side of this flap. So this can now be folded down and out of the way. And I also took our long thread tails on either side and you can tuck them up here. And that's what this piece of duct tape is. I tucked them underneath the zipper placket and I secured them just with a piece of duct tape here. So my apologies that my camera was not filming when I did those 2 steps, but the back of your flap should now look like this with your flap liner cut away. Okay. Next, we are going to mark the rivet hole placements. It's going to be just a tad different than what we did on the front. And I am going to now measure 5/8 of an inch above this seam and centered on the handle. I'm going to mark a dot there. 5/8 of an inch above that seam and centered on the handle. We're going to do the same thing to this side. I like to move my zipper pull out of the way so I can have a flat surface. Okay, 5/8 and centered, another dot. Perfect. And then the 4 rivet holes that we're going to do at the below the seam are all going to be the same measurements that we did before. So 3/4 of an inch down from the seam and 3/4 of an inch away from the side of the flap. Mark a dot. 3/4 of an inch down from the seam and centered within the handle. Make a dot. Okay, 3/4 of an inch down from the seam and centered within the handle. And one more. 3/4 inch down and 3/4 inch in. Make a dot. Okay, and now we are ready to punch the holes for these rivets. All right, all of our holes have been punched down here. And next we're going to set just these 2 rivets that are up here on the handles. But before we do that, we're going to move our hardware down to the base of our handles like this, so that when we set our rivet through, the hardware is captured underneath the rivet. Okay, I have set those rivets, so now my hardware is secured in place and no longer floating free on the handle. So this is what our two flaps should look like now, and we are going to put these aside until it's time to install them on our bag.